For a man that needs little introduction, please welcome Dr. Gudelunas.
I forgot yesterday. I had trying to tell my jokes and every stupid thing. Some went over like a pregnant high jumper, you know. But I want to thank you people, Roberta especially, but all of you people. You don't know how it makes me feel from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, because tomorrow I'll get excited and forget or Friday when we're wrapping up. So I really, really look forward to this. I really appreciate you people. I can't believe it. I really can't. But I really try my heart out because you people are so great. I love the Coachella Valley and only good memories, and this makes it even better. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Not bad for a Lithuanian kid from Minersville, Pennsylvania, you know. All right, Teddy Roosevelt, after he was with the Rough Riders, in that same year, 1898, he ran for governor of New York, won a surprisingly close election. That could have been the end of Teddy Roosevelt's political career in a lot of ways, but he did win the governorship of New York, and he proved to be a good governor, as he was good at everything. And the boss of New York State, a guy named Tom Platt, Republican boss, he didn't like Teddy because Teddy wouldn't play ball with the politicians as much as the old Pauls would, and they wanted to kind of ease him out. When William McKinley's first vice president, Garrett Hobart, as I mentioned yesterday, died, McKinley, who was going to be renominated in 1900, he needed a new vice president, so Platt and the real boss of the Republican Party all over the country, a guy named Marcus Alonzo Hanna. They called him Dollar Mark because he was so rich. He and Hanna, with Hanna being very reluctant on this, they cooked up a scheme to make Teddy Roosevelt vice president, hoping that would kind of ease him into just a limbo where nobody would remember him because the vice presidency was considered a laughingstock at that point. John Nance Garner, one of Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president, was asked what you thought of the vice presidency. He said, I'll become vice president, but my mother's 92 years old. Don't tell her I'm vice president. She'll be ashamed of me. And he served as vice president for 8 years. His mother lived the whole 8 years, and she never knew her son was vice president. She was from Texas, and that would explain it. And I guess I could tell you this, when he was asked by a female reporter, and there weren't very many female reporters in those days, back in the 30s, what do you really think of the vice presidency? He had been Speaker of the House, and he said, it's not worth a bucket of warm piss. And she said, I can't print that. He said, then say warm spit, but get out of here. And he got away with it. Oh, well, those were the days, huh? All right, well, anyway, they kicked Teddy upstairs. In 1900, they convinced Teddy Roosevelt to become vice president. He realized that they were playing him, but he felt he did ask a lot of his close friends, including Henry Cabot Lodge and others, you think this is a good gamble? And they said, yeah, you've made something out of everything. You'll make the vice presidency important. So he decided to take it and gave up the governorship then of the most populous state in the Union. And until California passed New York out in the early 1960s, New York remained the most populous state in the Union. Now it's, I guess, third. Okay, but anyway, Teddy was vice president. He took the oath on March 4th, 1901, and it looked like he was going to have 4 years of kind of being in the wilderness as he was when he was in the Dakotas. But as Roosevelt luck would have it, like I like to say, in September of 1901, William McKinley went to a Pan-American expedition in Buffalo, New York. You go to Buffalo, you expect trouble, right? Buffalo. No, I won't get into the joke. Desert Hot Springs East. All right, what the hell? All right, so I had to get that one in. But anyway, he went to this Pan-American expedition in Buffalo, New York. It was the first expedition in world history to be lighted completely by electrical power. There were no candles or whale oil lights or whatever they had. It was going to be all electricity, and it was a big deal. And he formed a reception line. McKinley was a very gentle man, even though he was a military hero during the Civil War and all. He was a very kind-hearted man, very humble. And he agreed to form a reception line. And this guy, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, simply got a gun, wrapped a loose bandage around it, came up to McKinley and shot him twice in the abdomen. As you could see, that picture is fairly realistic there. It appeared as though McKinley was not going to die at first, but the bullets were very hard to get at. He developed an infection, he developed pneumonia, and he died 8 days after he was shot. Czolgosz, again, was an anarchist. In these days, there was a violent strain of anarchism where they believed, the anarchists, some of them, believed that if they killed great world leaders, they could eventually destroy all governments. There were several assassinations, including of a Russian czar back in this era, and McKinley was unfortunately one of the victims. Okay, in September, when Mark Hanna, McKinley's best friend, and Mark Hanna was also the boss of the Republican Party, was also a United States Senator. When Mark Hanna was told his best friend had died, he said, "My God, that means that damn cowboy is President of the United States." Not like, what are they going to do about poor Mrs. McKinley, who I told you was an epileptic, and McKinley was so worried about him dying and who's going to take care of her. But Mark Hanna was only worried that Teddy Roosevelt was going to take over. Teddy Roosevelt cabled him or telegraphed him and said, "Don't worry, Senator Hanna, I'm going to carry McKinley's policies out. You could rest assured." He said, "Yeah, I'll rest assured. You're going to carry him right out to the garbage pail. That's where you're going to carry McKinley's policies." But Teddy Roosevelt then becomes president from 1901 till 1909. He was reelected in his own right in 1904, so he served 7.5 years as president. He was only 42 years old, as I said, when he became president. He remains the youngest man or person ever to accept that role. That's why I once thought there'd never be a woman president, because you have to be 35, and I didn't think any woman ever turned 35. All right. Jack Benny could have, yeah, he could. He was 39, right? All right. But anyway, and this is the only way I could explain it. There was an age beginning called a progressive era. Progressive means liberal progress. The progressives wanted to progress. The United States has never, ever, ever, I don't care if it's the New Deal or the middle of the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, we've never had a more liberal, progressive time in American history than we did from about 1900 to the beginning of World War I in 1914, or at least till our involvement in 1917. This almost 20-year period, 15-year period, was the most liberal, progressive, reform-oriented period in American history. Both parties developed progressive wings. If anything, the Republicans developed a bigger progressive wing than the Democrats. Many reforms came of it that I'm going to talk about tomorrow or Friday when I talk about the election of 1912. The progressive era climaxed, peaked in 1912 when 75% of the people, 75%, voted for a progressive candidate. There were 4 candidates who ran for president in 1912. Only one was a true conservative. He got 23% of the vote. The rest of the vote was divvied up amongst 3 progressives, including Teddy Roosevelt. But I want to make this clear. While he was president, Teddy Roosevelt was not a progressive. He never said that. He was a good, solid Republican. He liked to call himself a wise conservative fending off radicalism. Teddy Roosevelt believed that a lot of European countries were going radical. They were developing socialistic governments, stuff like that. Communism was even being talked about. And Roosevelt felt that in order to fend off radicalism, you had to give the people some crumbs off the table. So he believed in reform in order to prevent radicalism. But he believed that government could be used as a positive force. Government was good if it was run by the right people, like him. And he believed that a government was a positive force if the common people accepted the fact that educated, well-meaning, well-intended people would run the government. Most progressives, be they Republican, Democrat, or an independent progressive party that was briefly formed, all of them believed in the positivity of government, but government that was well run and well regulated. But Roosevelt always said, I was a wise Republican conservative who was willing to give the people some reforms in order to share the wealth a little bit so that we didn't have more radical things occur. All right, people back here were suggesting single-payer national health insurance. People back here were suggesting Social Security, unemployment compensation, things that had been adopted in Europe. And Roosevelt honestly felt it was his job to kind of prevent that from happening here in the United States. But he was a big government guy. If anything, the Republicans were more in favor of big government back here than were the Democrats. It was a lot of changes took place during the New Deal, but back here it was that way. He called himself a wise conservative, a radical conservative, or a conservative radical. He called himself a flexible reformer who was willing to adopt some progressive ideas in order to prevent a socialistic radical turnover of the United States government. He feared revolution, and he said the worst kind of revolutions are revolutions from the bottom up, like the French Revolution in its third phase in the early 1790s. So he was a good, solid Republican. After he left the White House, and he was not quite 50, he left the White House, or he just turned 50, in 1909. He handpicked his successor, a guy named William Howard Taft. That was his boy. He made him Secretary of War. He loved William Howard Taft. He told the Republicans, you must nominate William Howard Taft. And they did. Okay, Teddy. And then he thought that William Howard Taft screwed up. He went off on a big game tour of Africa, went to Europe to get his Nobel Prize and all that kind of stuff. But when he came back, he was convinced that Taft had double-crossed him. What was the truth was Teddy Roosevelt missed the limelight. He missed being the bride at every wedding and a corpse at every funeral. And he actually went into the White House without an appointment, came into William Howard Taft around 1910, 1911, after he's only been out of office a couple of years. He said, Taft, I made you president. You screwed up. Now get out of the way, and I'm going to run in 1912. Taft told him to go to you-know-where, and they became enemies for a long time. They eventually reconciled, but they became enemies. And when Roosevelt, in 1912, 4 years after he left the White House, he tried to come back in and beat Taft in the primaries. He couldn't quite do it. So then, and only then, in 1912, when he did not get the Republican nomination, Teddy Roosevelt then formed a new party called the Progressive Party, and only then, and only briefly for about a couple of years, he adopted all the radical progressive ideas. Not only those that he tried to ward off while he was president, but many more. He became very, very progressive, very radical. But when he lost the election in 1912 and knew that he split the Republican Party and caused Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat who he hated, to win the election with 41% of the vote, because the Republicans, he and Taft split up 51% of the vote. He realized he had made a mistake. He came back into the Republican Party, almost was nominated in 1916, except he was too much of a warmonger. The war in Europe had broken out in 1914. We didn't get in until 1917. Hope I'm not going too fast. But Roosevelt wanted us to get into the war, and the Republicans in 1916, I think, would have nominated him, except they felt he had alienated too many German Americans who obviously didn't want us to get into the war against Germany, and the Germans by this time were voting heavily Republican, and they didn't want to risk losing that German vote because of Teddy Roosevelt. And he was not nominated. The Republicans lost that election of 1916 very narrowly. But let me tell you, by 1920, Roosevelt was firmly back in the Republican Party totally. And if he had lived, but he died in January of 1919, 100 years ago this month, when he died, had he not died, had he lived till 1920, and he would have only been about 60, he would have been nominated by the Republicans, and any Republican, especially Teddy, would have won in 1920. Hell, Harding won in 1920, and if Harding could win, anybody could win, all right? The Republicans put it very simply. We could nominate a rag doll, and we could win in 1920, and they nominated somebody dumber than a rag doll, and they did win. And he wasn't actually stupid. He was just a slob, as Alice Roosevelt said. All right. But anyway, Roosevelt would have been reelected as a Republican in 1920, except he was dead, and that was a slight problem. Don't laugh. I was campaign manager for a guy who lost to a dead man. I was a Democrat in an area that was solidly Republican, and we used to run guys just to put up a show. So one guy said, well, I'll run if you're my campaign manager, like a joke. And you had to sign your name to all of his petitions and all. Okay, what the heck? And it turns out his opponent dies before the election. And the ballots were printed. And in Pennsylvania at that time, you had paper ballots, and that was it. They were printed, boom, end of it. And the guy stayed on the ballot, and he beat my man. So I was campaign manager for a guy who lost to a dead man. Don't hire me for a campaign manager. Don't ever do that. All right. Roosevelt, as you know, is ranked as one of the great presidents, but please remember he was a good, solid, middle-of-the-road Republican, maybe a little bit to the left of, as a progressive while he was president. His progressive era came later, but he did a lot of great things. He governed to what we call the militant center. He said, I'm a violent middle-of-the-roader. He said, I'm a progressive with the brakes on, but I like that. He said he was a violent middle-of-the-roader. He always got publicity. He made sure his name was always in the paper. He had this controversial daughter, the beautiful family. He knew how to play the press better than Donald Trump will ever play the press, and Trump could play the press, but Roosevelt did it better. He was just magnificent. He held the first regularly scheduled news conferences, and there were no more look forward to presidential news conferences until Franklin Roosevelt and really Kennedy, who used to have those funny press conferences while he was president. But Teddy Roosevelt was just amazing. They'd be fighting to get into his press conferences. So it was like a bi-weekly show. All right. So he even named his program, he called it the Square Deal. He was the first president to name his program. If you become president, you want to be ranked as a great president, name your deal. You had his distant cousin had the New Deal, Harry Truman, some of you people should, Fair Deal, right? Kennedy had the New Frontier, Johnson, the Great Society, Trump, the greatest deal ever. I got to call him and tell him that one. Maybe, or let's make a deal. No, he wasn't on that one. All right. Anyway, so he even named it Square Deal. His wife was very outspoken, very beautiful, set styles, the styles she didn't set, Alice did. That's one of the reasons Alice and her stepmother didn't get along, because who was going to set the styles like Jackie Kennedy did for those couple years? And oh my God, who had the nicer dress, Alice or her stepmommy? And there was rivalry there. As there's rivalry, let's face it, between Ivanka and Melania. I mean, it's just the way it is, and it was true. They even renamed the White House. It was called the Presidential Mansion, the Executive Mansion, and Mrs. Roosevelt, Teddy's second wife, insisted on calling it the White House. And she even had it repainted a little more white. It had been repainted white. I don't know if you knew this. It was originally gray, but it was burned the British burned it during the War of 1812, and it had to be repainted. And some of my contractor friends that aren't in jail anyway, there are a couple that they're going though. All right, but some of my contractor friends said if you ever have fire damage, the best color to paint over it is white, a heavy white. And that's why we repainted the Executive Mansion white after the War of 1812. All right, and then Roosevelt's wife insists on calling it the White House, and it's been called that ever since. Okay, some of the great things he did as president. He was not perfect. Probably today, maybe Friday, I'm going to talk about some of his shortcomings. Like everybody, he had shortcomings. Every president. Washington, Lincoln, I don't care. He was not too strong on race. He didn't particularly like immigrants, white immigrants. He didn't think anybody but white people should be allowed in, but there was a new flood of immigrants called the New Immigrants pouring into the country, 1 million a year back here. In fact, in 1910, we reached our peak when the percentage of foreign-born, 15%. We're not there now, but 15% of Americans were foreign-born in 1910 during the Progressive era. Roosevelt welcomed the new immigrants who were mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were white, but they weren't Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And Roosevelt felt they were good people, they're good laborers, but they should accept rule by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite, like him. He was not only a bit of a white supremacist, but he was an Anglo-Saxon white supremacist. Kind of a little difference there. But again, I don't want to condemn him for this, because to say that Teddy Roosevelt was weak on race and he didn't particularly like the new immigrants or didn't think they were capable of being, like, for example, a Lithuanian being a college professor, that would never happen. I don't want to nail him, because that's when you condemn someone in the past by the standards of today. That's called presentism or generational chauvinism. And it would be like me saying Einstein was stupid because he couldn't do PowerPoint. All right, and condemning Andrew Jackson because he had slaves, or George Washington because he had slaves, or condemning Teddy Roosevelt because he was less than a civil rights activist, is not fair. It was wrong not to be, yes, but it was rare for any white man of any ilk to, promote civil rights or anything like that back in his era. Compared to other politicians, he was somewhat liberal on that. But still, by today's standards, no. But it's not fair to go back and rap him about that. Remember last year, I told you that Andrew Jackson has fallen in those ratings all the way down, what was he, about 15th? He used to be up in the top 4 or 5. Because current historians berate him for what he did to the Indians and what he did to black people. He owned slaves. But unfortunately, that's presentism. So, I'm not as susceptible to that as some. All right. In 1902, the square deal, I think, took its real big turn. In 1902, he settled the anthracite coal strike. And this is near and dear to my heart. I was born and raised in the anthracite coal regions of Pennsylvania. Anthracite coal is hard coal. It's very rare. Most of the coal in the world in the United States is bituminous or soft coal, which is used for powering plants and stuff like that. Hard coal or anthracite, 98% of the American supply and like 95% of the world supply of anthracite is mined in the northeast corner of Pennsylvania between a town called Scranton and Pottsville. If you ever heard of Pottsville, you probably heard of Scranton. And I told you that joke about Buffalo, first prize a week in Buffalo, second prize 2 weeks. Well, Scranton, first prize a week in Scranton, second prize you have to live in Scranton. All right, Scranton has gone to the dogs. Believe I hate to say, nobody from Scranton. Yeah, I'm sorry. All right, Pottsville's no better, believe me. The anthracite area has gone down, unfortunately. But anyway, anthracite coal then, and to some extent now, very limited, is used for home heating. And most of the homes in the Northeast, and in fact in a large percentage of the Eastern Corridor, where a lot of our people lived back then, anthracite was used for heating homes. And in 1902, there was another strike in the anthracite region. And the coal regions, especially the anthracite regions, and the soft coal regions, but especially the anthracite region, had a reputation for long, violent strikes. You might have heard of the Molly Maguires, were part of the anthracite region. They were prominent in my hometown of Pottsville. All right, but anyway, this coal strike went on for over 5 months. The mine owners, the anthracite mine owners, were determined to prevent unification. The union, called the United Mine Workers, had been very successful in the bituminous fields, but it had made no inroads in the anthracite fields. And a handful of companies, literally 4 or 5, controlled the whole anthracite business. And they were determined to keep the UMW out of the anthracite fields. And the trouble, the UMW, who had a great union leader named Johnny Mitchell. There's still a holiday that the United Mine Workers get. One of their paid holidays still today is Johnny Mitchell Day. My dad had a bar, and a lot of miners came in, and I asked them, who's Johnny Mitchell? I don't know if we get a day off account of him. They didn't even know who Johnny Mitchell was. But Johnny Mitchell was the leader of the UMW in this 1902 strike. All right. The problem with unionizing the mine workers in the anthracite fields, less so in the bituminous fields, but still a problem, but really in the anthracite, there were too many miners from too many different countries. They were immigrants, they didn't speak English, they didn't trust each other, they didn't trust the bosses who tended to be English or Welsh, they didn't trust the owners, almost all of whom were Protestant, and they were either Catholic or Orthodox, even some Jewish miners, and it was a mess. But in 1902, they went on a strike, and it lingered on. It started in May. Well, there was a lot of coal stockpiled, fine. But by October, people were getting nervous. They were talking about a fuel famine and all this crap. And Roosevelt knew that he was a brilliant guy, remember? He knew 1902 was only 2 years ahead of what? 1904, and he's going to run for election in his own right, and he didn't want any stupid coal miners or mine owners messing him up. So when the mine owners wouldn't even talk to the UMW, they ostracized Johnny Mitchell. One of the mine owners said, look, Roosevelt said, talk to the miners, at least negotiate. And they said, look, Teddy, this guy's name was Bear. He was head of the Reading Company, the biggest of the mine companies. And Bear said, listen, Roosevelt, God made me president of the Reading Company. So God wants me to take care of these mine workers, not some union radical like Mitchell or some idiot like you. Not a way to win friends and influence people. All right? But that's what he said. God made him president of the Reading Company. Therefore, God wanted him to take care of the miners by making them work 12 hours a day, 6 days. Okay, all right. So anyway, it got real bad, and the mine owners especially wouldn't talk. Mitchell, because he had the weak hand, Mitchell was willing to do anything, and he buttered up Teddy Roosevelt, and Roosevelt kind of liked Johnny Mitchell. He didn't like Bear and a couple of the mine owners. So he called him into the White House, and they said, all right, we'll talk. But we won't talk directly to Johnny Mitchell. He could be in a room, but we'll talk to you, and then you tell Mitchell what we said. Yeah. So they tell Mitchell this, and Roosevelt would have to repeat it, even though they heard it. Okay. So finally, the mine owners wouldn't give an inch. So Roosevelt said, fine, I'm not going to be embarrassed. I'm not going to be embarrassed. If you don't negotiate in good faith, I'm going to send the army in. I'm going to take over the mines. And if I have to draft the the soldiers or the miners, I will. But we're going to run the mines. The government will run it. You're going to end this fuel famine. I'm not going to have people freezing to death all over the East Coast. So you better do something. And I mean it. I will nationalize the mines, or I'll at least send soldiers in the mine, and we'll just take them over. We'll keep the profits. And they knew that Teddy was serious. So what the mine owners did, reluctantly, is they agreed, everybody in the coal regions to this day. Teddy Roosevelt settled the strike. He gave the miners everything. Roosevelt was not that way. He believed in being fair to everybody. That was a square deal. Fair to labor, fair to management, fair to the stockholders, fair to the consumers, right? So he didn't settle the strike in favor of the miners. What he did is he got them to accept binding arbitration. He didn't settle the strike, an arbitration commission did. Both sides agreed to accept binding arbitration, and the arbitration commission was kind of neutral with a little leaning toward the companies who had the stronger hand. All right, so what happened? The miners wanted a 20% pay increase. Guess what they got? 10. The miners were working 10 hours a day. They wanted 8. Guess what they got? 9. The miners wanted the UMW recognized as a bargaining agent? No. But they would be recognized as an agent that could go into binding arbitration. Compromise, right? Oh, and Teddy wanted to be fair to the company, too. He allowed them to raise the price of coal 12%. So they more than recouped. Who got nailed a little bit? The consumer, maybe, because the price of coal went what? Went up. But, not that bad. So did Roosevelt favor the miners? His picture went up on all kind of barroom walls in the coal regions. I went into a couple old bars when I was a kid. There's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt on the damn wall. Why is he there? And I'd start telling him about the '02 coal strike. Get out of here. You nerd, you get out. All right, but anyway, Teddy Roosevelt actually settled the strike fairly. It was the first time, however, in American history that a president had intervened so clearly in a strike and not favored the companies. Grover Cleveland, about 20 years earlier, had intervened in a strike against the Pullman Company in Chicago. He sent in federal troops to break the strike. Several times in American history, United States Army troops were used to break strikes, always favored a company. Roosevelt was at least what? Fair. And this set up the principle in the future of binding arbitration. Didn't mandate it, but it set, and he was at least fair. And the miners fell in love with him. And when Teddy Roosevelt ran for president in 1912 on a third-party ticket, he carried two major states. One was California, yes, sir, and one was Pennsylvania. Absolutely. He was a god in Pennsylvania. The miners didn't know why. But I vote for Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, okay. All right. My grandfather voted for him because he bought him beers. That was more important. Okay. Buy Vincus Gudelunas beers, he'd do anything for you. Murder, whatever you wanted. All right. So the coal strike myth and reality, it was an important moment in American history. The president did intervene, but he didn't favor either side. He was fair. That was the first time it ever happened. But he did not bash the companies. In fact, the stock of the Reading Company rose exponentially after the settlement. Everybody was happy. The stockholders, Bear was happy. The miners were happy. Teddy was happy. And also, he got great publicity. President McKinley, who had preceded him. McKinley had quietly settled a mini strike in 1900. He had settled, kind of behind closed doors. But he didn't do it what? Publicly. Roosevelt went public. He said what Bear said. He said he told Bear off. He talked about Johnny Mitchell. He called press conferences. He got all the credit. He deserved a lot of it, but did he deserve all of it? No. But he just knew how to play the game. And then in 1902, another great thing that really helped the West, the Newlands Reclamation Act. This was sponsored actually by a Democrat, Francis Newlands, a senator from Nevada. The Newlands Reclamation Act was his great conservation move. It allowed the government to take money from the sale of Western lands and use it for irrigation projects, irrigation and damming projects. Roosevelt loved the Southwest. He loved California. He loved Arizona, Grand Canyon, all that stuff. But he realized what we needed was water. And the Newlands Reclamation Act set up the government to build flood control, irrigation projects. It set up great dams. And the Newlands Reclamation Act made the Southwest a vibrant part of the United States. And it's no accident that the most important state in the Union is now not New York or Ohio or Florida, but it's what? California. We got unanimity there. All right. But it is. And where would have we been without some of these water projects? So he was great. But beyond the Newlands Reclamation Act, Teddy Roosevelt's greatest gift to the American people, beyond his colorful personality and all that, was conservation. I had a professor, I'll never forget this. I had him in 1965 when I was a year or two old. And he said, remember, Billy, the greatest thing Teddy Roosevelt ever did is take conservation out of the conversation stage and make it a national passion. When a popular president gets behind something, it'll take off. Eisenhower, golf. Everybody says Artie Palmer. No, everybody says Artie Palmer made golf, right? Maybe television helped, but who really popular? It was Eisenhower. He was always golfing, right? He never was, Okay, a lot of presidents golf. But don't you think Eisenhower? Remember Kennedy on his 50-mile hikes? I had two guys came in my dad's bar. They were World War II vets. They went 50-mile hikes. Both of them had heart attacks. They both lived. They're going to go out because Kennedy told them to go on a hike. He stayed back at the White House with Marilyn Monroe while Jackie was hiking. Yeah. Go ahead, Jackie. Go, girl. You go. You show them. Hi, Marilyn. Okay. Or was it Angie Dickinson? Or was it Rhonda Fleming? Hard choice. Okay. There you go. So he put over 230 million acres under federal control. He created 5 new national parks, either created or expanded 150 national parks, started the first wildlife refuges. The first one was in the Everglades in Florida, but he did everything. He just was a great conservationist. But to be fair here too, Roosevelt always said, and I think Trump's trying to say this in his own way, Obama tried to say it in his own way, what you have to be careful when you become a conservationist and you start hugging trees, that's fine, Al Gore, but you don't want to mess up business either. You have to be fair. And Roosevelt always strove to be fair. Look, if there's coal on that land, or if there's timber that we need to make paper, for God's sake, or build houses, we're going to let the companies come in. But the government is going to regulate it, so when they cut down trees, they'll plant what? New trees. And we're going to have sensible conservation. It's going to help the environment. It's going to help our children and grandchildren have animals and trees and whatever, but we're not going to do it at the expense of American business and American workers. And he kept a well-balanced conservation program. Too much now, people think he was this wild, tree-hugging conservationist. He was not. He was good on conservation, but no major company ever complained about what he did to them. No coal company, no timbering company. He was always very fair, and they knew in the long run that was good for them because they could then peaceably go and cut timber, dig coal or whatever without worrying about a bunch of pickets coming out. So he was good there, and conservation was his major thing. And the Newlands Reclamation Act was passed in 1902, the same year as the coal strike. And one other thing, he was known as a trust buster. Teddy Roosevelt, with his big stick, busting trust, right? He hated big business, baloney. Teddy Roosevelt loved big business. His dad was a big businessman. He was rich. He didn't hate big business. Teddy Roosevelt said big business made America. It made us rich. And it did. And the future was not in small business, but what? Big business, let's face it. So he said, but he always distinguished between two kind of big businesses, they went beyond monopolies. They were called trust. Trusts are like super monopolies where you have interlocking directorates. Like, for example, Carnegie Steel also controlled the mines that dug the bituminous coal to make the steel. That's like a trust, right? Well, Roosevelt said trusts aren't bad. There are good trust and bad trust. What's a good trust? A good trust pays its workers fair, makes money for its stockholders, gives a good product to the consumers at a what? Fair price. What's a bad trust? A bad trust rips off its workers, rips off the consumers, even rips off its own stockholders sometimes. That's a bad trust. Where he saw a bad trust, he prosecuted. He'd use the Justice Department to go after and bust these trusts. But where he saw a good trust, he'd what? He'd let it go, in fact, encourage it. So let me be honest. Big business liked him. Big business contributed to his re-election in 1904. In 1912, even though he had become somewhat radical, many big businesses donated to him. And they backed him in 1916, and they would have backed him again in 1920. Some of his best friends were big businessmen, no question. He never hurt big business, but he wanted them to be fair, and he wanted the government to have oversight. I think this guy's fair, right? I mean, I once talked to a guy that was second in command of United Mine Workers, and I was going off on some liberal tangent, and he said, Billy, remember, if we destroy the mines, there'll be no United Mine Workers. Don't condemn the mines. They're giving us what? Jobs. We want better money and all, but don't close the damn, like a 16-year-old kid's going to close a mine. Okay, I had a big mouth, but not that big. All right, so trust busting. His most famous trust-busting case, when he did go after a trust, he made headlines. He made sure he got all the what? Credit. He made sure he had a press conference, all that kind of stuff. He went on Twitter. He did the whole bit. All right. Well, could you see this guy with Twitter? Holy mackerel. All right. He went after something called the Northern Securities Corporation. He started the antitrust suit in 1902, his greatest year, in my opinion. Eventually, the government won the case, and Northern Securities had to reorganize. Northern Securities Company was a railroad conglomerate that was trying to control all rail lines that led to the Pacific Coast from the Mississippi River west. The Northern Securities Corporation was headed by, get this, J.P. Morgan. Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, the greatest financier we've ever had, right? Until Paul Manafort. All right. We had J.P. Morgan, E.H. Harriman family, James J. Hill, and the Rockefeller Corporation. Those were the four major stockholders of Northern Security. That's like going after General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford at the same time. And he did it. So when he went after a company, he made sure it was colorful. He made sure he got credit. But was he a trust buster? He liked big business. He liked trust if they were good. In fact, he initiated, his government in 7.5 years, initiated 44 antitrust suits, 44. William Howard Taft, who succeeded him, and Roosevelt eventually turned against Taft, William Howard Taft, allegedly a pro-big business flunky, his government in 4 years initiated 90 antitrust suits. So who's the trust buster in history books in high school? Roosevelt. He busted 40 or initiated 44 suits in 8 years almost. Taft initiated 90 in 4 years. And Roosevelt initiated 44 antitrust suits. At least 144 trusts were formed while he was president, and he actually applauded that. So was he a trust buster who hated all big business? And he would have been crazy. Big business made us rich. I think they could have shared the profits a little more, but hey, we were the richest country in the world. All right, what about progressive legislation under Teddy? He did give enough to the progressives to keep the progressive Republicans happy, but he didn't give too much that would alienate the conservative Republicans. He kept the party together. In hindsight, that's the thing Taft couldn't do. When Taft became president, he couldn't keep the conservative Republicans and the progressive Republicans together, and that was his big problem. But Teddy did. He did give in to some progressive ideas. He had the Congress pass two great laws that restricted railroads. The greatest threat to farmers and small business people were railroads. The only way you could ship in these days was basically by rail. Trucks were still in the future. Canals had outlived their usefulness many years before. So it was really by rail. And the railroads had a life and death control over small farmers, small businessmen. And Roosevelt had the Congress pass two laws, the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, that both restricted railroads. It allowed the Interstate Commerce Commission, which had been formed back in the 1880s, but was rarely used. He rejuvenated the Interstate Commerce Commission, which we still have, and he allowed it to have more power to regulate railroads, and he had Congress pass two magnificent acts. I'll repeat it one more time, the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, which really, amongst other things, prohibited railroads from favoring large shippers over small shippers like farmers, give an advantage to, say, Rockefeller or Hill or Harriman and charge higher rates to small guys. No, the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act tried to eliminate that kind of stuff. It was a step in the right direction. He rejuvenated the Interstate Commerce Commission. There was a lot of trouble with mislabeling or no labeling of foods and drugs. Do you see that commercial that's on all the football games now? The most about Budweiser labeling. Do you see that? It's usually some medieval king or something that's going to label his Bud Light. You read what's in beer or Bud Light, you won't drink it. I had a friend that lost weight. Every time he wanted to, he read what he was good before he ate it. He read it on packaging. He wouldn't eat it. You ever read labeling on beer or liquor? Or almost anything. It's not good for you. You know Slim Jims? Those stupid little... Read what's in that. I guarantee you'll never eat another Slim Jim. All right. But anyway, there was almost no regulation of that kind of stuff. One of the problems with this government shutdown, you mark my words, is that the Food and Drug Administration is not being able to inspect stuff. Mark my words, that's going to be a big thing in a couple of days or at least a week. But anyhow, he had Congress pass the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required all major companies to label their food and their drugs. What are the ingredients in this drug? What are the ingredients in this food, right? And he also, this was very important back then, where you had corner butcher shops and all that stuff, the Meat Inspection Act. Meat had to be inspected, as he called it, from the corral to the can. You had to make sure that meat was pure. His men in the Spanish-American War had eaten beef that was embalmed. Embalming fluid was injected into some, I'm not kidding you, into some of the beef so they could sell. I don't know why they did. Imagine eating embalming fluid? Okay, but the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, I love that. Roosevelt wanted to assure Americans that there would be pure meats from the corral to the slaughterhouse, to the can. Canned goods were coming out. And God knows what was in those cans, right? But now you would at least be labeled. So he had the Pure Food and Drug Act, labeling drugs and foods, and then the Meat Inspection Act. All of that's still with us today. All right, so Teddy Roosevelt also wanted to do one big thing before 1904, despite all of this. He wanted to start construction of a canal, an Isthmian Canal. We were now a world power. We had possessions for the first time in the Pacific. We all of a sudden, after the Spanish-American War, had Hawaii and Guam and the Philippines and American Samoa. We were a Pacific power. And most of our battle fleet was always stationed along the Atlantic coast, where they were building a wall to keep out. No, okay. Our Navy now had to get back and forth, so we needed a canal. Roosevelt didn't care where we built the canal. He just wanted to start construction before 1904, obviously, election year. Was he obsessed with being reelected? Yes. Was he the bride at every wedding? Yes. All right. Probably the best route to this day would have been to build a canal through Nicaragua, because there's a big lake in the middle of Nicaragua. And you could have tapped into that. It would have been probably better. But it would have taken a year, 18 months to get a treaty with Nicaragua to get it going. And Roosevelt, there was a commission set up, in fact, 2 commissions, and they both recommended the Nicaraguan route. Everybody said we need a canal. But most engineers, most diplomats, almost unanimously recommended the Nicaraguan route. But Panama had certain advantages, like you could start it quicker, because the French had tried to build a Panama Canal. Remember, the French built the Suez Canal. That's why it doesn't work too well. No. Remember Ferdinand de Lesseps? In 1869, the French built the Suez Canal. You know who the first person through the Suez Canal was? Charles de Gaulle. No. Brigitte Bardot. No. You know who the first president through the... Why would I know this? Who was the first person through the Suez Canal? Eugenie, who was the wife of the Emperor Napoleon III of France. Yeah. Right up till the crisis of 1956, the British and French really controlled the Suez Canal stock. It was a private company. Well, anyway, Ferdinand de Lesseps and the French had built the Suez Canal, finished it in 1869. So they then started to build the Panama Canal, and they failed. They failed miserably. But they made headway, and they signed leases and all that stuff with the country of Colombia in northern South America. Their own Panama was a state of Colombia. Okay. So what Roosevelt wanted to do was take over the French headway, buy that out, and then simply start building the canal like tomorrow. You didn't have to wait for another treaty and all that nonsense. Everything would be quicker, despite all the recommendations. So, and the French were willing to sell, it was a private company, but they were willing to sell their headway and their equipment that was left over, all that nonsense, for $40 million. So the French company wanted us to build the canal where? Panama. Most Americans that had half a brain said we should build it through what? Nicaragua. But Roosevelt wanted the fastest route, at least to get started. That was Panama. So he said, no, we're going to build it through Panama. And he and the French company engaged in a little propaganda. The French company spent millions of dollars back then to try to convince Americans that the Nicaraguan route was dangerous. There were volcanoes. There's not a volcano in Nicaragua. There are active volcanoes, and all the Nicaraguan people are crazy, like the Panamanians are different. Okay, all right. So, but anyway, Roosevelt and his French company convinced the American Congress, with a few bribes, that we should build a canal in Panama. And then Colombia had made a tentative agreement that they would sell us the canal zone for about $25 million, and we'd pay a rent of $250,000 a year, plus it would go up every year. Seemed like a good deal. But then when Colombians found out how desperate Roosevelt was, they wanted to up the ante. They wanted more than the $25 million. And Roosevelt got infuriated. He said, what right do these Dagos, that's what he called them, have to not sell us that canal zone? Like Russia wants to buy California. What right do we have not to sell it? Okay, there you go. All right, so anyhow, sell them Scranton. But anyway, so what he did is he convinced Congress to go through Panama, and when Colombia wouldn't sell, the French company, and with a little help from Roosevelt, started a revolution in Panama against Colombia. The revolution was led by a firehouse. A group of 100 firemen are going to start it. Could you see Washington leading 100 firemen against the British Empire? 100 firemen who the French company wined and dined for a week, got them drunk, and they are going to have this revolution. Viva la revolution. Okay, they're going to, them and Castro, they're going to revolt. All right. When the Colombian army came in to crush them, the American Navy just happened to be off the narrow isthmus and bombed in front of the Colombian army so it couldn't get into Panama. Panama, led by these 100 firemen, declared its independence. Less than a day later, Roosevelt recognized the independence of Panama after a sovereign revolution, if there is such a thing. And the Panama, the guy that orchestrated it was a Frenchman named Philippe Bonavarilla. Panama appoints him, a Frenchman, they appoint him ambassador to the United States. He immediately comes up to the United States, signs a treaty, which the Senate ratifies within 48 hours. Mitch McConnell was the leader, and he got it right through. All right. The Senate ratified the treaty. We gave Panama, I think it was $10 million, and we took the canal zone, and it was supposed to be 6 miles wide. They increased it to 10. And we held the canal zone as our own until the Jimmy Carter administration, when we gave it back. All right, but anyway, he did start construction of the Panama Canal. He dramatized this because in 1906, he became the first American president to leave the country while in office. The first American president ever to leave the country while in office. He went to Panama to oversee the early construction of the Panama Canal, which was completed in 1914, open to American traffic and totally open to world traffic around 1920. And that was right when World War I broke out, so it was probably good he did. But did he rip Panama off from Colombia? Yeah. Did we feel guilty? No, until in 1921-22, oil was discovered in Colombia. And guess what companies wanted to go into Colombia and drill oil? Hint, they were from the United States. We then gave Colombia $20 million more as a, we're sorry, now let us drill. All right, so eventually we did compensate Colombia more, but that's why the Panama Canal, and I loved during the Carter administration, people said, that's our canal, we got it fair and square, why give it back? Yeah, we got it fair and square. Depends what you mean by fair and square. Roosevelt at a cabinet meeting said, I think it's pretty obvious that I got the canal fairly, right? And one of his cabinet members said, yeah, Mr. President, you were accused of seduction and you actually committed rape. And he fired him. Okay, you go with Sessions. Get out of here. All right, another thing he did that I think was good at the time. Might not seem so good since World War II or since the New Deal, but at the time, I think it was good. The stewardship theory. The presidency, except during wars, was always weak compared to Congress. If you ask the average person now, what's the most powerful branch of government? The president, the Congress, or the courts? Almost everybody say the president, right? Certainly since World War II. I don't think there's any question. But up until Roosevelt, most presidents followed what they called the constitutional theory of presidential power. What was that? that the president should only do what the Constitution tells him to do, which is very little, really, if you look at it. Sure, he has some control over foreign policy and that, but really Congress was supposed to be the dominant branch. That's the way the Founding Fathers, when all of these politicians, original intent, we want to go back to Washington and Franklin, yeah, okay. But they forget that then you shouldn't like presidential power, you should like congressional power, but that's hypocrisy, we'll let it go. All right, but Roosevelt believed differently. He believed the president, now that we were a world power with world responsibilities, we needed to act quickly, and Congress has to act deliberately. You cannot act quickly. We're not supposed to. President, one man, can act quickly, right? One woman can act quickly. So he announced the stewardship theory, and almost every president since him, except maybe Calvin Coolidge and maybe Warren Harding, but no other maybes. Every president, Republican, Democrat, Obama, Trump, I don't care, they're all steward presidents, whether they admit it or not. What's the stewardship theory? Twofold. First of all, the constitutional theory said the president only does what the Constitution tells him to. This flips it. The president could and should do anything he wants as long as it's not unconstitutional. So he broadens presidential power to bring us into the modern age where we're a world power, right? So the president should do anything he wants, help govern, as long as it's not illegal. The constitutional theory was very limited presidential power. Stewardship theory, very broad. And again, almost every president since him, certainly since the New Deal, every president has been an avowed steward. The only guy that came in threatening to do something different was Eisenhower, and believe me, he did neither. I like Eisenhower. I think he was a fine president, but he was one that was going to give power back to Congress, back to the states. They all say that, and it never happens. Power is intoxicating. Whatever your hat size is, when you become president, it grows. That's for sure. Well, how would you like when they pay pomp and circumstance? You come in there, sure. All right, so the stewardship theory, and he named the presidency the bully pulpit. He was unabashedly in favor of meeting the people, having press conferences, giving newspaper interviews, all that kind of stuff. And he named the presidency the bully pulpit. And he said the president should be the leader of the people. He should do anything he wants as long as it's not illegal to help the cause of the people. And he should at least be co-equal with Congress. And like Trump now, he had a little trouble with Congress. He became very disgruntled with the judges, because if you're a strong, active president like him and Trump and Obama, and you like to do things, well, you're not going to like the courts, because they move what? Slowly. The Supreme Court just got a case. They said, we'll decide it in 18 months. 18 months, what are you going to be doing? Well, we have stuff to do. Hey, you know one thing about every federal judge, there are like 800 running around the country. You know what their pension is? Full salary for life. And if your wife lives, she gets it for her life. Full salary for life. They're the only federal workers. The president gets about $200,000 for life, but the judges, and this is district judges to the Supreme Court, full salary. And if the judges get a raise, you get a raise while you're retired. I'm going to be a judge for one day. And there's no time. You don't have to be there like 30 years, Okay, so anyway, in 1904, Roosevelt ran for re-election. Not really re-election, but look, the South in those days was the solid South. The old Confederacy always voted what? Democrat. It's opposite now. It's the opposite now. But the old South hated the Republicans because Lincoln was a what? Republicans were voting against the party of Lincoln. So anyway, the South voted for his opponent, but Jesus. I'd say it's Freudian, except I don't know what that means. Everybody says it's a Freudian slip. I still don't know what that means, other than Freud said if you weren't toilet trained right, you're messed up. So I guess my mother, Mom, you screwed me up. Okay, but anyway, Roosevelt carried everything except the solid South. He was a big, tremendous runaway. He got 56% of the popular vote, which was amazing, because in states like Louisiana, Alabama, he got almost no votes. And still nationwide, he got 56. That's good. When Reagan carried 49 of the 50 states in 1984, he only got like 53% of the vote. This guy, even though he couldn't get any votes in the South, got 50. Imagine, he was real popular. I just wanted to couple of things. There was his opponent, Alton Parker, who was a conservative Democrat. One New York newspaper, the New York World, said they endorsed Teddy Roosevelt. And they said, we favor the impetuous candidate of the Conservative Party, Roosevelt, to the conservative candidate of the impetuous party, Parker. I remember that from 6th grade. Can't remember my Social Security number. Certainly can't remember I know my Medicare, or I would have been broke. All right, but anyway, I'll get into him in a minute. But anyway, he beats, Alton Parker was a very conservative judge from New York State. 2 New Yorkers ran against each other, and Roosevelt just annihilated him, right? And he was so happy. And this is the biggest mistake he ever made in his political career. When he was reelected by that landslide, I mean, nothing approaching it until Roosevelt in 1936, really. But when he won by this big landslide, he announced under no circumstances would he run in 1908. There was no 2-term amendment. You could run for as many as you want. Remember Franklin Roosevelt, his cousin, was elected what? 4 times. The first president bound by the 2-term amendment was Eisenhower. Republicans passed it to embarrass Franklin Roosevelt, who was dead, and they lived to regret it, because Eisenhower could have been reelected easily to a 3rd term in 1960, and Reagan probably could have been reelected again for a 3rd term. So the only 2 that were popular, and maybe Obama, but the 2 presidents that since that amendment have been popular enough to have been reelected to a 3rd term were 2 Republicans, ironically. But he could have been going on forever, but he announced. And again, he was only 46 years old. So he said, I would not run in 1908. He did not, but then he did run in what? 1912. So people said, Teddy, you said you'd never run for a 3rd term. You think Trump and Obama could get around it, Clinton? He said, yeah, but I meant 3 consecutive terms. I sat one out, so I'm really not running for a 3rd term. That's fake news. Can't trust that Rachel Maddow. Not one. All right? So anyhow, his vice president, who I'm going to mention on Friday, turned against him, actually, toward the end of his administration. He was a conservative Republican named Charles Fairbanks. He was a very, very proper, prim Indianan. Did we ever have another Indiana vice president who's proper and prim and won't go out with a woman in public unless it's his wife? Although he was pretty damn close to that Kirstjen Nielsen the other day. Remember that? Pence coming out with her? Pence won't go out to supper with another woman unless his wife's there. Neither would Kennedy. All right. Now, wait. Don't pick on my hero. He was Catholic. We're not allowed to do that. So, hey. All right. But anyway, he was from Indiana. That was supposed to be a joke. Pence jokes don't go over. I'll edit that out. All right. But, and in fact, a little trivia. You know, I can't resist trivia. The northernmost city, I once won $25 on a call-in radio show back in the 60s on this. The northernmost city in the United States is named after a vice president, Fairbanks, Alaska. You from Fairbanks? From where? You're from Fairbanks? That close to Fairbanks. You know Sarah? Yeah, no. Does she like dirty old retired history teachers? Oh, yeah? Okay. All right. All right. And here's a guy that ran with Parker for vice president. He's from West Virginia. You might guess that. Henry Gassaway Davis. He was 81. The oldest person ever to run for president or vice president, although that record's going to fall soon, isn't it? All right. But he was 81. Back then, that was dead. I mean, the life expectancy was about 45. After that, you were a dinosaur, you know. But he was 81, very wealthy. And they figured he'd contribute to the campaign. He did, $100. So that was it. But anyway, Roosevelt was reelected, and he'll serve a full term of his own. And I'm going to talk about next time his foreign policy, which I already did the Nobel Prize. And I'm going to do, when he sent the fleet around the world, the Great White Fleet, he called it what? My fleet. It's his fleet. That's right. That's right. And then his post-presidency, and he runs for president in 1912, and you could see he gets more votes percentage-wise than any third-party candidate in history. He got 27% of the vote. No third-party candidate ever did that. That's still a record today. Ross Perot got 19%, I guess in 92. Ross Perot got 19%. I like Ross Perot. He quit the Navy because they cursed. I would have been a great football player until I found out they could tackle back. Hey, that's not fair, Coach. What do you mean? He tackled me. My dad said that wouldn't happen. Okay, so we'll do 1912. They were the candidates in 1912. I just got to show you, right? Here was this guy. I'm going to show you again on Friday. Somebody do quickly. I'll quit in a second. But he was probably the most important California politician, except for Earl Warren, whoever lived. Hiram Johnson was governor those years, senator, all that long. He was one of the people who helped kill the Versailles Treaty. And he was Teddy Roosevelt's vice president running mate in 1912. He was a bull mooser, Hiram Johnson. You never heard of him? Undoubtedly, Earl Warren would probably be the only other, certainly Jerry Brown, maybe Ronald Reagan, but Reagan's impact was more nationally than in California. So I'd have to say this guy, that's something you conservatives don't want to see. It's going to be bad enough on Friday, block your eyes. But this is what they advocated, Teddy advocated in 1912, but not what? While he was president, but that he did come out for that briefly. And there was a guy that shot Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. Roosevelt was shot, bullet went in the left side of, or the right side of his body, and bullet stayed there till he died, but he gave an hour speech while he was bleeding out. That's a bull moose, and that's a nut. All right, there's his shirt. I'll talk about that later. There's William Howard Taft. Some people said he weighed 340 pounds, but his doctor, Dr. Ronnie Jackson, Admiral, said he weighed 188. Yeah, but don't laugh at this guy. He was a great president. He later on became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Ever hear of his son, Bob Taft? Taft-Hartley law? If Eisenhower didn't come around in 1952, didn't come along, Bob Taft would have been President of the United States, and I think a good one. And his grandsons became prominent, great-grandsons, yeah. William Howard Taft, the only man ever to be president and serve on the Supreme Court. Yipper. All right, there's Eugene V. Debs. He was a socialist. He ran for president 5 times. In 1920, he was in jail. That was his campaign picture. So all you Democrats, remember, and I'll leave you with this, and please be here Friday. You can run for president from jail. And I meant what I said at the beginning. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm going to cut, to be fair, I cut up Clinton, I cut up Gore. Oh, Wilson's teeth. Yeah, let's skip that. There was his wife, his second wife. She was very proud of part of her body. I think you can guess which part. She claimed she was descended from Pocahontas. Pocahontas only had one child. She died at 20. She only had one kid. How do all these people? But I know somebody that's descended from Pocahontas. What do you mean, oh, come on. All right, there's Liz, Pokey. Trump, I'll give him that. He has the best nicknames, yes, sir. I wonder what he'd call me. All right, so there you go. A nothing burger, he'd be right. Okay, but there you go. I'll go over all this on Friday, and Teddy Roosevelt, great presidency. Again, any flaws that he had, I'm going to mention them again briefly on Friday, but to condemn him for anything he did wrong, I think, is to practice presentism. Judging the past by the standards of today. Okay? Thanks a lot.